4 months after Pearl Harbor, America was reeling. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins, morale was shattered, and the Japanese military seemed unstoppable. Then came April 18, 1942, the day 16 B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier and did the impossible. They bombed Tokyo. This is the story of the Doolittle raid, one of the most audacious military operations in history. After December 7, 1941, America needed a win. Badly. The attack on Pearl Harbor had devastated the Pacific Fleet and given Japan free rein across the Pacific. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, all falling like dominoes. President Roosevelt demanded action. But there was a problem. Japan was too far away. US bombers didn't have the range to reach Tokyo from any American base or airfield. The idea seemed impossible until Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle proposed something crazy. Doolittle's plan was simple in concept, but insane in execution. Load Army Air Force B-25 Mitchell bombers onto an aircraft carrier, sail to within striking distance of Japan, launch the bombers, bomb Tokyo and other cities, then fly to China where the crews would bail out or crash land and hopefully link up with friendly forces. Everything about this plan defied logic. B-25 bombers were medium-range land-based aircraft. They were never designed to take off from carriers. The deck was far too short. They were too heavy to land on carriers, so this was a one-way trip. The crews would have to take off, fly over 600 miles to Japan, drop their bombs, then fly another 1,200 miles to China on fumes, hoping they'd make it. Doolittle handpicked 80 volunteers, pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers and gunners, and trained them in secret. They practiced short takeoffs, stripped their planes of unnecessary weight, and loaded extra fuel tanks. Nobody told them their target until they were already at sea. When they learned they'd be bombing Japan, not a single man backed out. On April 2, 1942, the USS Hornet departed San Francisco carrying 16 B-25s strapped to its deck. The sight was bizarre. These land bombers looked absurdly out of place on a carrier. The flotilla included the USS Enterprise for fighter protection, cruisers, destroyers, and oilers. They headed west into enemy waters. The original plan called for launching 400 miles from Japan, giving the bombers a better chance of reaching China. But on the morning of April 18th, still 650 miles out, the task force encountered Japanese picket boats. The Americans sank the boats, but the damage was done. The Japanese now knew something was coming. Admiral Halsey made the call, launch immediately, even though they were much farther out than planned. At 8:20 a.m., with the carrier pitching in heavy seas, Doolittle's bomber roared down the deck. He had just 467 feet of runway. His plane dropped toward the water as it left the deck, then climbed. One by one, all 16 bombers successfully launched, a minor miracle in itself. The B-25s flew in low over the water to avoid detection, then climbed as they approached the Japanese coast around noon. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. Air raid sirens didn't sound until bombs were already falling. The psychological impact was enormous. Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka had never been touched by enemy aircraft. The physical damage was relatively minor. The bombers carried small bomb loads, hitting military targets, factories, and fuel depots. But the symbolic damage was catastrophic for Japan. The sacred homeland had been violated. The military command had failed to protect the emperor. Japanese leadership was humiliated. For America, the raid was a desperately needed morale boost. Newspaper headlines screamed about the daring attack. Americans finally had something to celebrate, a reason to believe they could win this war. But for Doolittle's raiders, the mission was far from over. Running critically low on fuel, they'd launched 200 miles farther out than planned. The crews faced impossible choices. Darkness fell, weather deteriorated, navigation became guesswork. 15 planes headed for China. One diverted to the Soviet Union, where the crew was interned for over a year. Of the 15 that reached China, not a single one landed safely at an airfield. Crews bailed out in darkness over mountainous terrain or crash-landed. Miraculously, most survived. Chinese civilians and resistance fighters rescued many of the airmen, sheltering them from Japanese patrols. 8 raiders were captured by Japanese forces, 3 were executed, 1 died in captivity, 4 survived brutal imprisonment until war's end. Of the 80 men who launched that morning, 71 survived the mission and its immediate aftermath, a remarkable survival rate given the circumstances. Japan's retaliation was savage. Furious that Chinese civilians had helped the American flyers, the Japanese military launched a campaign of terror in eastern China. Villages were burned. Civilians were massacred. An estimated 250,000 Chinese died in retribution for the Doolittle raid, a horrifying price paid by innocent people for helping American airmen. The raid also convinced Japanese military leaders to extend their defensive perimeter, leading directly to the Battle of Midway in June 1942, where Japan would suffer a devastating defeat that turned the tide of the Pacific War. The Doolittle raid did minimal physical damage to Japan, but its impact was profound. It shattered Japanese assumptions of invulnerability. It forced Japan into strategic overreach. Most importantly, it gave America hope at its darkest hour. Jimmy Doolittle, who feared he'd be court-martialed for losing all 16 bombers, instead received the Medal of Honor. He went on to command air forces in North Africa and Europe. The raiders became legends. Until his death, Doolittle kept a bottle of cognac, salvaged from the 1896 vintage, that the surviving raiders would toast at their annual reunions. Each year, they'd drink to those who had fallen. In 2013, when only 4 raiders remained, they held their final toast. The Doolittle raid proved that audacity, courage, and a little bit of calculated insanity could change the course of history.